Welcome everyone to this lecture on version control. Before we jump into the world of Git and GitHub tomorrow on day 1, let's have an optional overview of version control. If you're already familiar behind the motivation and use cases behind Git, feel free to skip this lecture. Otherwise, let's have a quick overview. So what is version control? When you're working with digital files, whether it's a docx Word file or a programming file, such as a .py Python programming language file, you probably don't finish all your work at once. You don't just open up the file, have all your work on the first day, and then never touch it again. In that case, what you need to do is actually have software that's going to be used to manage and track changes in the files themselves. That's called your version control. Now you could actually create your own version control system. Maybe you've already done this in the past, such as using multiple files. I remember back in my college days, I would do something like create a paper.document file, and then if I had some changes to it, I'd create my paper version 2. And then maybe I added a couple more changes and had my final version. But then sometimes the professor comes back, asks you for another change, and now you have something like my paper, actual, final, etc. So clearly, this is starting to become a bit of a mess. But technically, this is some sort of version control. I'm separating each file out by some sort of checkpoint into multiple files. And while this idea kind of makes sense, the idea of using multiple files for it can get messy very fast. So we can't actually use this exact approach, but the idea of maybe checkpoints is something we could use later on. Alternatively, you could try to decide just to keep updating the same file over and over again, but then what happens if you want to go back to a historical version, perhaps because of a bug in your newest version? And what if you actually want to work with others on the same code? Neither the multiple file or just a single file with no history really works in that case. We want something that's flexible to track changes, but also allow us to work with others. Clearly, we need a more robust system that can allow us to work on the same file, yet retain information about previous versions. A version control system, or VCS, allows us to track changes, undo changes, compare versions, work with others, and more. Keep in mind that version control is actually starting to become more common in typical consumer tools. For example, if you're using Google Docs, you can actually see the version history and the checkpoints that were marked during the version control of that particular document. So this idea of checkpoints within a document or file is probably already a little familiar to you anyways. Git itself is one example of a version control system. And while there are others, so maybe you've heard of Subversion or Mercurial, etc., Git is by far the most popular version control system in the world. And fortunately for us, Git is free and open source, and we can download it onto our own computer. Now you may be wondering, what is GitHub or GitLab? Some of these companies or services you've seen online that kind of sound like Git. Well, while you can use Git version control system completely free locally and use it to track changes on your own local files on your own computer, if you actually want to host your code on the internet, it's typically easier to use a hosting service. So GitHub and GitLab and those sort of companies are actually using a hosting service on the internet to connect your local computer code that you're writing on your local machine to some sort of repository on the internet that makes it much easier to share and collaborate with others. Keep in mind, GitHub is owned by Microsoft, and the way it works is it integrates easily with Git and allows you to have versions of your code live on the internet for you and others to access, update, and change from any machine. It also comes with a bunch of other features that we'll cover in the last day on this training. And GitHub is by far the most popular online repository hosting service, which is why we focus on both Git and GitHub. So to reiterate, GitHub is not the same thing as Git. Git is an open source version control software system that we actually install locally onto our own computer, and technically speaking, we could just use it locally forever for free. GitHub itself is a company that operates a service for hosting files on the internet that are managed using Git. So you can think of GitHub as essentially a hosting service that can allow you to do things like add comments to code or perform automated actions on code and other features and services. Now, fortunately for us, GitHub also has a very generous free tier that we're going to be playing around with and exploring later. So on day one, we'll end up installing Git and creating a profile on GitHub. We'll go much deeper into the differences between them in day one. So let's briefly visualize how something like Git would work on a simple file. Keep in mind, we're going to do a much deeper dive into all of this on days 1 through 5, but let's just get a brief visual overview. So let's imagine that you've set up your initial project, and this can be a text file, a programming file, or really any digital file that you can edit and make changes to. So maybe you add some code to your initial project document, and then you decide to add some more code. Each time you're doing this, you're actually setting a checkpoint. That's a historical point that you can always go back to. You can think of it as a save point if you were playing a video game. You could always go back to a previous save. So you have your initial project, adding some code, adding some more code. Now let's say in an instance, you try some very new code, but unfortunately, it actually ends up being buggy, and it ends up breaking the rest of your code. So luckily, with a version control system, you can easily just roll back to a previous checkpoint. So here, we can just roll back to this part where we added more code. Now, what you can also do with a version control system is actually create a branch or a fork that allows you to essentially make a copy of that file and then edit separately from the main branch. So you could have a colleague create their own fork or branch here, maybe add some branch code. And what's really special about version control systems like Git is they actually allow you to then merge branches together. So maybe you really like this branch code and your colleague has tested it out, and you actually want to bring that in to what you're calling your main branch. So then you can merge these together and end up having a merged version with this new code that takes both your code and your colleague's codes and merge them together. And you can always swap back and forth between different branches and roll back changes. So a version control system such as Git allows you to add save points or checkpoints to your work, and allows you to do things like create changes, update existing code, undo changes, create branches for others to work on, and merge work together. Up next, we're going to have an optional command line review for people who are not totally familiar with the command line. This is because Git commands themselves are written at the command line. So navigating the command line is a required skill for this course. But don't worry, it's just a few simple commands to remember. We'll cover them in the next lectures. Remember, there's separate lectures for Windows users versus macOS or Linux users. Go ahead and navigate to the lecture that's right for you.